This happened years ago, when I was 19. I'm now in my mid-20s. I still remember this very clearly, because of just how creeped out I was. Back then, I was living 600 plus miles away from my parents in a different state. Even though there was a distance, my mom and I still spoke on the phone at least 2 times a week, and we were still really close. So when we found out her cancer was back, I didn't think twice about dropping everything to drive down to see her. A plane ticket would have been too expensive, and I had a 10-year-old Toyota that might have been a bit beat up, but still got me from A to B cheaply and quietly. My parents weren't thrilled at the idea of me driving the 11 hours by myself, but my mind was made up. So they offered me a deal. I would stop at a rest stop every 2 to 3 hours and stretch my legs and call them. And in exchange for this courtesy, they would pay for my gas. If I didn't call within the 3-hour window though, they would assume I'd been in an accident and call me repeatedly, interrupting the audiobook or podcast they knew that I would have on. I gladly accepted the deal. And that's why I found myself at this particular rest stop at 2:45 a.m. This was actually one of the nicer stops. Well lit, multiple vending machines that didn't have huge cages around them. The payphone wasn't broken, and overall, it looked clean. There were a couple of cars with people sleeping in them. I still had 15 minutes before I had to check in with my parents. I got out of my car, stretched, and then almost jumped out of my skin when I heard a man's voice right behind me.
Miss, can I ask you for a favor?
I turned around, and there was a man leaning against my car. I have no idea how he got there so fast. I didn't see him when I parked, but there he was, uncomfortably close to me. He looked to be in his 40s. He didn't look dirty or twitchy. He was too close, but his body language didn't scream threatening in any way. And even though I was 19 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and at that point in my life, 110 pounds soaking wet, add in the fact that I had already binged a lot of true crime media and knew the dangers of a girl my age alone at night with an out-of-state license plate, my dumbass asked what he needed. He told me that he had accidentally locked his keys and his phone inside his truck, and asked if he could just borrow my phone real quick to call his friend. It would just take a second, and it would really help him out. I almost handed him my phone. I was reaching into my pocket to hand it to him with a Pollyanna, no problem. And then I actually looked at his face. Like I said, this rest stop was surprisingly well lit, and this guy looked really normal, except for his eyes. He had dead shark eyes. You know what I'm talking about. It's the Ted Bundy, Dick Cheney, actress in the Glade commercial who is trying to convince us she's in love with a dumbass who doesn't know how air freshener works eyes. They're smiling, but the eyes are vacant and creepy and staring way too hard. I got that feeling, that runaway feeling. I knew immediately not to hand this guy my only way to call for help. So I put on my best customer service smile and told him, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, but I don't have a charger and I need to save all my battery for the tracking app my parents have on my phone. I need that juice to call my parents as well, which I actually have to do right now, but good luck with your situation." With that, I turned and walked about 20 feet away. But he doesn't leave. He was still just leaning against my car, watching me every step of the way. Now, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave him alone with my car because he creeped me out, and he has that serial killer face. So going off to the bathroom is out. But I also wanted to get away from him, prove I'm not going to help, and maybe he'll leave. I could technically get into the car, but I would have to get really close to him, unless I crawled over my passenger side seat. And it didn't look like he was moving. So I did the first thing that popped to mind. I called my dad. And my dad, for the first time that night, didn't pick up the phone. When I heard his voicemail, I glanced back. That guy still hadn't moved. He was still locked in, staring at me. So I faked a phone conversation with my father. I angled my body so that the guy couldn't see that I had hung up the phone, and loudly said that I should be home in about 30 minutes, when in reality, I was still at least 4 hours away. I mentioned exactly where I was, and reassured the fake caller that this was a good rest stop with plenty of lighting and a couple visible security cameras. The guy still hadn't moved, and now I'm running out of steam on this fake conversation. In the years since, I've thought about a lot of things I could have said while pretending to talk to my dad, but in that moment, I was beginning to seriously freak out, and my mind just went blank. So I hung up and didn't know what to do. I had hoped the fake call would scare him off, but he was still leaning against my car. I stalled for another couple of minutes. I bought cookies from the vending machine, walked around a little. At this point, he's been leaning against my car staring at me for about 10 minutes. I honestly debated waking up one of the men sleeping in their parked cars and asking for help. And just the thought of having to wake someone up to help me get into my own damn car annoyed me enough that I stopped stalling and headed back to my vehicle. I decided that unless he touched me, I'm just going to pretend he isn't there. He waited until I was unlocking my car door before he started talking to me again. He told me once more that he really needs to use my phone. He's stranded here unless he can call his friend to bring his spare key. He's not angry or begging. His voice sounds weirdly friendly. But he had been creepily watching me for way too long while blocking my exit, so I'm not falling for it. I almost pointed out the working payphone, just in case I'm wrong about this and I was being a bitch to a guy who needed help. But then he leaned forward as I was getting in, and I lost all nerve, slammed, and locked the door as fast as I could. He didn't move until I started the car and put it in reverse. That's when he finally stepped back and let me pull out. I didn't even have my seatbelt on. I was so focused on just getting away from him. Halfway out of the rest stop, my mom called me. My mom, who would freak out if I don't pick up and who was already sick. I could still see him in my mirror. He was standing right next to where I was parked with his back to me now. He was far enough away that I felt okay parking once more to answer the phone, but I kept the engine running and kept a watchful eye on him. I don't want my mom to worry, so I told her that everything was fine, where I was, and my ETA. Now that I was locked in my car away from the guy, I was beginning to feel like I had overreacted. She scolds me about speeding, and I tune her out because the guy is now moving. As my mom lectures me about road safety, I watch the guy cross to a truck, unlock the door, and get in. The keys being locked in no longer seemed to be an issue for him. I watched the truck head back out to the freeway and drive out of sight. I had to pretend to be fine to not upset my mom. I didn't end up getting back on the road for another 20 minutes. And when I did, I didn't speed. There was no way that I wanted to catch up and see that truck. I found out years later that the closest city to that rest stop has a major problem with sex trafficking, and that girls who look like they don't live nearby, or maybe look like they are living out of their cars, tend to be targets. I don't know if that was what was happening, or if he was just trying to scare me into handing over my phone. Either way, creepy guy at the rest stop, let's not meet. When I was about 16 years old, I worked at a restaurant as a pianist. It was a nice, semi-formal restaurant, not very trendy, but seen as a well-established place where parents would take their graduating children and elderly couples would have date nights. White tablecloths and fresh flowers on the table. It was a pretty popular place. It was a great gig, especially since I was quite young, and my parents would drop me off in the evenings twice a week, Friday and Saturday nights. It was in an older part of town, the kind of place where you don't go walking at night. I live in South Africa though, so you pretty much never walk at night. We have car guards in most South African cities, and while there are sometimes dodgy guys trying to make some quick drug money because they found a reflective vest in the trash, my restaurant had this wonderful guy. His name was Dottie, and he was a huge dude from Zimbabwe. He'd always walk with me up the path when my parents dropped me off, and come to tell me when my parents had arrived to pick me up. Part of my pay was a free staff meal, and on this occasion, my mother had decided to come in early with me so we could eat together. As we walked in, the owner immediately saw me and dashed over to us, clearly bursting to tell me something. Apparently, earlier that day, a man had come in and asked him if the pianist started at 8 tonight, as usual. The owner had confirmed yes, and asked if he'd wanted to book a table. The man said no, and the owner, seeing that the guy looked like he probably couldn't afford to eat there anyway, had asked why he inquired in the first place. The man then informed him that he'd had a dream, and he was going to come in and marry the pianist. The pianist was his soulmate, and he wasn't going to miss out on this chance to let her know. Quite bewildered at this information, and thinking maybe a friend from school was just playing a joke, I'd asked what the guy looked like. I remember the owner trying to put it nicely. Well, he was sort of short, 30-ish, plump, long hair, and he had a hat on. I had no friends who matched this description, and at this stage, I was the only female pianist at the establishment, so my mother and I were quite weirded out. We sat down on the closed-in balcony to order, right by a big window. It was about 7:45, quite dark outside already, and I was getting ready to leave the table to start playing, when a movement in the shrubs outside the window caught my eye. "Mom," I whispered, and she looked over to where I had jerked my head. There, skulking outside the window and watching us, was a short, very overweight man. He was wearing all black, with a dirty black trench coat and a black fedora. He had long, dark, stringy hair and a large silver cross hanging around his neck. It was a sinking, horrible feeling, realizing that he was watching me. I don't know if it was mostly because I was pretty young and sheltered, or realizing that this strange man knew who I was, what I looked like, thought about me, wanted to marry me. This made me feel almost debilitated with fear. My mom, however, quickly realized that while I was in the view of the window, she wasn't. She told me, "Stay here," got up, and left the table, making sure to stay out of the view of the man. She went to the manager and got him to phone Dottie on his cell phone. We were sitting towards the back of the restaurant, and Dottie was on the street. After about a minute of me sitting there, pretending not to notice the beady-eyed, sweaty-looking man outside, I saw the light of Dottie's torch bouncing off the hedges. From the corner of my eye, I saw the man start to scuffle around, trying to work out which way to go. I took this opportunity to stand up and get away from the window. I sat in the very back until Dottie came in to tell me that it was okay to start playing. They never told me whether the man ran off or had to be removed, or what exactly happened anyway. They wouldn't tell me any details, which sort of just made me more apprehensive about the whole thing. Dottie just said that he wouldn't ever let that man back in. He told me that he drove a rusty red small car. I'd later find out it was a really old Fiat Uno. I found this out because every 2 weeks or so, on one of the nights I was working, it'd be parked down the street, far away enough from the restaurant that Dottie couldn't make him leave, sometimes even around the corner, out of the field of view, until we were driving home. I began to get real familiar with the sound of that car though, the rattly old exhaust pipe, and I knew the license plate number by heart. Sometimes when we drove past, I could see a shadow of the man in the driver's seat. Sometimes I couldn't. That's when I would wonder where he was then. From that point on, my parents had Dottie's number saved to their phones, and my dad would come to get me when it was dark. Sometimes when I was waiting to be picked up if we closed early, I'd start heading down the path to see if my parents were back. Dottie would see me from the gate. Sometimes he would beckon to me to come down and wait with him, and we'd hang out. Sometimes he shook his head. "Not yet, sissy." That's when the car would be down the street. I never really saw that man again, so there was never really anything I could do about it. It was something that was always in the back of my mind though. I continued to play piano at this restaurant through my final year of high school, and then I ended up quitting when Dottie moved back up to Zimbabwe. So, Dottie, my friend and protector, I want to thank you. And creepy black fedora stranger in the rusty red car, I'll be way too happy to never meet again. I've been reading the stories in the sub for a pretty long time, and up until now, I've luckily avoided frightening situations that may be worthy of a post. That is, until this happened about 3 weeks ago. Though I'm generally a slightly paranoid person as it stands, I'm glad to have read so many of these stories. It probably helped me to make a safe decision on that night a few weeks back. I'm a small woman in her early 20s who lives alone in a smallish condo with her cat on the second floor of the building where I moved in a few months ago. There are 2 doors one must enter to get inside my apartment. The first is outside, leading into the building, and the second is obviously my apartment door itself. Tenants have keys for the outside door, which has only one lock, whereas the actual apartment doors have both locks and deadbolts. Otherwise, a visitor must be buzzed in to be allowed inside. For some clarity, there are 8 apartments per building in my complex, with an outside door on either side of the building. My apartment is closer to the back and is situated directly above a currently empty apartment. My downstairs neighbor to the left is my age, the only neighbor I'm close with, and is often away staying with her boyfriend. This means that while I live technically near others, my home is slightly isolated within the complex. There is an outdoor light situated next to the door, but I'd noticed when returning home one evening that the bulb had either broken or burned out, and I hadn't personally thought to contact maintenance to fix it, as it was late and I was tired. There hadn't appeared to be many others home in my building, as the parking lot on my side wasn't particularly full. I was taking care of a few chores around the house at around 10 p.m. Friday night, running the dishwasher and folding laundry. I'd had a long week at school and had arrived home probably an hour to an hour and a half before. My cat was keeping me fine company as I puttered around my house. It's hard to hear much outside while the dishwasher is going, and I was generally distracted, but barely noticed a soft rustling sort of sound outside. It didn't seem too strange, aside from it being repetitive. I really wasn't unnerved at this point, but being constantly anxious anyway, was too frightened of the dark to look outside the window to that side of the building. This might very well have been totally unrelated, but I think it bears mentioning. Fast forward just a little while, and I was standing at my kitchen counter working on a report on my laptop. Over the sound of the dishwasher, I heard a soft knock on my door, upon which my cat bolted for the bedroom. Unsure at first if I had really heard anything, I went still and waited for just a moment. There it was again, quiet, but a little longer and faster this time. This made me pretty uneasy, as it was so late, but my first thought was that it might be one of my neighbors. I approached the door quietly and take a look out the peephole. As I mentioned, the only neighbor I know well is a young woman who lives downstairs, but I'm familiar with what all the other neighbors look like. The man standing outside my door was completely unfamiliar to me. Tall, wearing either a dark blue or black jacket, Caucasian with dark hair. He didn't look too unusual, just unfamiliar. What was unusual, though, was how close he was standing to the door. Even distorted through the peephole, he was so close I would guess him to be standing square on the mat in the hallway, leaning his face in slightly and staring directly at the peephole. There was an odd sort of energy in his stance, if that makes any sort of sense. I immediately felt extremely unnerved and glad that I make very little noise when I walk. I backed up about 3 feet from the door and waited. I'm not totally sure how much time passed, but he probably stood there for another couple of minutes before I heard him go downstairs and out through the door. Now, I've had a neighbor from downstairs knock on my door in the evening before to ask me if I was experiencing a power outage, which he was. He'd brought his wife with him, probably to reassure me, and stood a reasonable distance back from the door after knocking firmly. This was exactly what this strange guy didn't do, which is why it set me on edge. However, always trying to convince myself I was making a big deal out of nothing, I told myself that this had probably been a similar sort of situation, but was far too immediately uncomfortable to consider answering the door. I just decided to listen to my gut. I texted both my mom and a male friend about the situation. my friend offered to come keep me company. But by that time, I had talked myself out of some of my nervousness and assured him that I was fine. I went to sleep about an hour later and woke up having mostly forgotten about this whole experience. But shit got weird that next day. Only in the context of what I saw the next morning did the knock really become frightening. I had agreed to accompany my mom and her boyfriend yard sale hopping that morning in some nearby neighborhoods. It was going to be a lazy Saturday anyway, and they were going to pick me up early, around 7:30 a.m. My mom gave me a call from her car when they arrived on my side of the building to let me know to come down. I grabbed my bag, went out my door, and headed downstairs. As soon as I opened the outside door, something was clearly wrong. The handle turned very loosely. The door opened very easily, and upon shutting again behind me, the handle itself completely fell out of the hole. Looking back, I wish I'd taken a picture of it because it's a little hard to describe, but it had been very clearly messed with. The outside portion of the door handle was held in place with screws, and that part was completely missing now. The lock component of the handle was also missing. Essentially, what was left was a stripped handle with a hole in the middle where the keyhole should be. Both those parts, when I searched the surrounding grass and sidewalk, were nowhere to be found. Essentially, it had been thoroughly fucked with. My mom, having heard about the knocking incident from me the night before, was not cool with this at all and insisted I report the incident. I contacted maintenance and the police. But as there are no cameras situated near my apartment, and definitely not near my door, I'm not particularly hopeful that this will lead anywhere. I've gotten no additional information as of now. In talking with my neighbors, who were obviously made aware of the vandalism, nobody who was at home or awake around that time heard anyone knock on their door, or saw, heard, or came into contact with the man that I described. Maybe this is overthinking it, but this makes me more nervous. It makes the approach seem more targeted and less random, as if he knew it was just me there. For what it's worth, the outside door handle was replaced very quickly that afternoon. Nothing like it has happened since. While I'm still not all that sure what to make of it, the totality of the situation still has me on pins and needles. A tampered with outside door, a strange visitor to my apartment late at night, along with no explanation to go with it. That's the recipe for paranoia, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't have a dose of that going on right about now.